Morning again. You know what I was thinking about this morning? This always makes me nervous. It should make you nervous because I'm going a little bit off my notes. So this morning I was thinking about eyebrows, okay? And there's a reason. I don't know if some of you have noticed that I have a little bit of Italian blood in me. Thank you, Dad. So if I want more than one eyebrow, sometimes I have to do a little bit of, tweezing in between. And so if you give it more than one day, then the growth makes it longer, and it actually makes it easier to get a hold of, right? So you can get a more minute, a more close up, right? Some of you are like, I have no idea. I'm telling you, this is right, okay? So all that to say, what we're going to do is we're going to take a longer look, a farther out look, so that we can move in and get to a more minute perspective. So with that, some 6 months ago, at the beginning of this year, we started off the year looking through this overall enveloping scope, or what our theme would be for the year, which was legacy. Do you guys remember that? It was like on New Year's Day, like way back when. We're talking about legacy this year. And then for the last several weeks, what we've been looking at are the words in red, or the words spoken by Jesus that are imparted to us through the Gospels and that have left lasting impact on our lives. And so this morning, and over the next month, the rest of this month of August, together we're going to be spending time in a story or book that doesn't even mention the name of God. And yet, the evidence of his work is spoken all throughout it. Legacy, as a reminder, is defined as the enduring impact of a person's life, choices, character, left behind for others. The story of Esther is that for the Jewish people. And the impact that it leaves behind, the truths extend to us too. So again, going back out into this bigger grasp, within our Bible, the book of Esther, it's grouped in this, what we call narrative literature. And so you can see here, just to get a bigger scope, we've got all these different books, and we have, narrative literature, so it follows after this book, Ezra and Nehemiah, which was considered to be one book. And we've broken it up in our Bibles, but it's one book, it's one story. Esther follows that in this literature narrative. But before that, we had this grouping of 5 books, 5 being Penta and Tuch being law, so the Pentateuch, the books of the law, that Moses was given credited for being the author of. So we got these first 5 books, then Moses passes away. It picks up with his predecessor, who is Joshua. You can see that the narrative literature, if you go back to the other slide, you can see it better. Thank you. It starts with Joshua, and it extends all the way through what we conclude or what we grasp in that with Esther. So these are our narrative literatures. They continue the story of Israel and the people of Israel. And so with that, then, yes, chronologically, though, the story of Esther, it falls in this timeline. It falls within the story of what's recorded as Ezra. You following so far? So in Ezra, you can see the purple across the top. The story of Esther actually falls within that chronologically, even though it's grouped after that in the Bible. And so with this, in the context, 100 years earlier, before this chart, if you're looking to the left of it, 100 years before the book of Esther comes into play, we've got, to the left of that chart, the nation of Israel, where Israel has long gone. The nation of Israel was divided into 2 kingdoms, right? The northern and the southern. So the northern kingdom, they're already long gone. They're carried off into exile for disobedience and not following God's ways. And now, this 100 years later, we're at where Judah, the southern kingdom, is just about to go off into exile, the rest of them, with the Babylonians. It's like the nation, Judah, the southern part of the kingdom, maybe we can relate, it's like they just couldn't get it together. They couldn't follow God's instruction for them, his plan of blessing, and so finally they're given over to the rebellion, and it leads to the downfall of this kingdom and the destruction. And so most of the Jewish people, those that survive, they're carried off from Israel, from this southern part of the kingdom, they're carried off into exile, into Babylon. And so that's 100 years prior. 50 years pass, and we get to Cyrus the Great. He conquers the Babylonians. And so now Israel, who's dispersed over Babylon, becomes subjects to the Persian Empire. Okay? And that happened when Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 BC. And that's where we pick up in the book of Ezra. That's where that story starts. So just so we can see how Scripture says it for itself, that may sound really exciting to some, and to other people, you just are like, what are you saying? It's okay, the Word says it. Let's look at it. In 2 Chronicles chapter 36, it gives us just what we just rehearsed right here. It tells us the story of what's happened. So in 2 Chronicles 36, starting in verse 15, it's talking about Judah, the southern kingdom, and it says that the Lord, the God of their ancestors, sent word to them through his messengers again and again, because he had pity on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked God's messengers. They despised his words, and they scoffed at his prophets until the wrath of the Lord was aroused against his people, and there was no remedy. He brought up against them the king of the Babylonians, who killed their young men with the sword in the sanctuary, and did not spare young men or young women, the elderly or the infirm. God gave them all into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. He carried to Babylon all the articles from the temple of God, both large and small, and the treasures of the Lord's temple, and the treasures of the kings and his officials. They set fire to God's temple and broke down the wall of Jerusalem, which was the capital of Judah. And they burned all the palaces and destroyed everything of value there. He carried into exile to Babylon the remnant who escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and his successor until the kingdom of Persia came to power. The land enjoyed its Sabbath rest. All the time of its desolation it rested, until the 70 years were completed in fulfillment of the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his realm and also to put it in writing. This is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any of his people among you may go up, and may the Lord their God be with them. So there's this very interesting thing that happens when Cyrus conquers the Babylonians. He takes possession, and he comes, and the people of Israel become his subjects, that he is moved. God moves his heart, and he gives permission for any of these scattered remnant that want to go back to Judah to rebuild, they can go back. You see this at the end of Chronicles. It's also at the beginning of Ezra. That's how that book starts off. And I remember reading this just a month or so ago, reading through Ezra, and I was wondering, I'm like, why did God have to stir the hearts of the exiles? Like, why wouldn't all of them want to go back, right, if you're given that opportunity? But if you stop and consider, go back to what, first of all? Their city, their nation has been demolished. It's been leveled out. It's been destroyed. It's wilderness right now. And not only that, but if you are younger than 50 years old, because at least 50 years have passed since this time. If you're younger than 50 years old, you may have never known this nation. You've only ever heard about Israel. Why would you go back to a place you haven't known when you're already established? You already understand your surroundings. It's the only thing you've ever known. Or if you're older than 50, maybe 60, maybe 70, and you had once lived here, you've just now, again, you've been established in this new place for at least this long. So what would make you want to leave everything now that you know, the comforts, whether captivity or not, that you understand, and go back to a place that physically is going to be demanding? Remember, you're 50, 60, 70. You're going to be physically demanding. There's real dangers. There is the enemy that wants to kill you. There's wild animals. There's no shelter. There's no security of food. So why would you go back, right? So it's no wonder that these exiles that are all over, that God would have to move in their hearts to go back to rebuild. And so some do. Some are stirred, and they go back to Judah. But the others, the rest of this nation, these people that have been dispersed, they're still all over this empire, this Persian Empire. So with that, we've got some go back, and then some stay, and 70 more years pass. And there's a couple king changes, and then King Xerxes, he becomes king. It's the grandson of Cyrus the Great. So King Xerxes, he becomes king, And it's during the start of Xerxes' reign. This is where then the book of Esther and that story starts. It's once Xerxes has come into reign. And it's set in Susa, which is the capital of the kingdom, the Persian kingdom. And if you look, just so we can have context, Susa, it sits in what we know today as modern-day Iran, right? The Persian capital spread out over all this land, from Israel and all the way across this arching way. So back to Esther, right? That's where we're going, guys. Esther. So Esther is part of narrative literature. It's part of this story that's being told, but even more so than that, Esther is also considered of the genre to be a court tale. A court tale because it's a story that takes place in the court. It's a drama in the royal court, and it's based on historical figures and perhaps, some scholars would say, even actual events. Now that perhaps might be a little disturbing for some of us. Some scholars, though, before it's too unnerving, it wasn't uncommon in that period for an author of a court tale to base stuff on true stories, but also add maybe their own flavor, right? We have right now, we'd say a movie that's based on a true story, but it's not a documentary, right? It's it is based on a true story, it's a true story, but the author maybe has added some other things to it to move it along. So you've got some scholars that sit in that camp that say, this is true, and yet it could have had some, artistic license. And then you've got other scholars that say, it could have happened exactly as it's written, and anything that is questionable could also be explained. Okay, so you've got these two different camps, but no matter, there's a great story here. And then also, the author's unknown. So some think maybe it was also Ezra that he wrote this book of Esther, and others think, well, maybe Mordecai was actually the author of this. He was there. So with these different unknowns, no matter why would the Jewish people include Esther in the overall scripture? Why would we still today want to keep Esther as a part of our overall scripture? And there's a couple things that this is not exclusive, but there's a couple main reasons. One is that the book of Esther, it gives us a glimpse of the world in which God's people were living. You can put that map up again, Don, for a second. Just a glimpse of this world that they're living in, that they're far from home, they're far from their promised land, they're far from the way that God had intended for things to be. Okay, so that's one thing that Esther is showing us, just this extent. And it portrays, too, the memory and why the Jews were to celebrate Purim. We're not going to talk about that today, but later, a little teaser. Don't worry, it's coming the last week of August, okay? We'll get to hear more about Purim. But it captures and it preserves that memory of why that's celebrated. So this story, it's masterfully crafted. It has mirroring, it has comedy, it has plot twists, it has villains and heroes and all the things. And it also has this rare thing that we already mentioned, which is that it did not mention God. So in that time period, again, any writings of the ancient Near East, it would be very odd that they wouldn't at least mention a God, the gods, or the one true God. So it's almost certainly intentional and with irony that the author has not mentioned God, because though he's not mentioned, the evidence of his work is clearly proclaimed all throughout this book of Esther. And so this book, Esther, it's a mirror, it's a reflection of their current state, where they had to be wondering, with all these things going on, they're living as exiles, they had to be wondering, God, where are you? Where are you? Where are you at work? Where are you? And for us today, it's also a testament, and for them too, of an impossible situation to which God brings relief and rescue. God is still bringing relief and rescue. How many of you have ever read the book of Esther? Okay, how many have ever heard the story of Esther? How many of you have watched the movie Esther? Anybody? Okay, so whether you've read it or not read it, this would be a good time in this next week to reread or read it for the first time, the book of Esther, because we're going to be in it, and it's going to be really helpful if you have more of a context. But this morning, Well, in short, we'll just tell you two so that you can know if you have not any of those things. But in short, Esther is a story about an orphan Jewish girl who becomes the queen of Persia. That whole map we saw up there, I mean like a whole rainbow on it. And then she risked her life to save her people. So that is like the shortest synopsis ever. And this morning, we're going to spend the rest of our time focusing solely on the first two chapters of Ezra. And this is going to be intense, guys. But the reason we're here is to look at the Word. And so we're going to read together the first two chapters of the story, of this court tale of Esther. So Esther chapter 1. Here we go. By the way, I just want to point out, Xerxes, his name, Xers, is pronounced Xerxes. So for some of you that may know, it's because that's why. I just want you to know that, okay? Some of you get that reference. And going on, so this is what happened during the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Kush. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. And in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles of the provinces were present. For a full 180 days, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace for all the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen fastened with cords of white linen and purple, material to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant, in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink with no restrictions, for the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. On the 7th day, when the king Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, we'll just say M, B, H, B, A, Zephath, and Carcass, to bring before him Queen Vashti wearing her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. Since it was customary for the king to consult experts in matters of the law and justice, he spoke with the wise men who understood the times and were closest to the king: Karshina, Shethar, Hedmatha, Tarshish, Meres, Massena, and Mamukin, the 7 nobles of Persia and Media who had special access to the king and were highest in the kingdom. According to the law, what must be done to Queen Vashti, he asked. She has not obeyed the command of King Xerxes that the eunuchs have taken to her. It's kind of like he's talking about himself in 3rd person here. It's kind of weird, but then Mamukin replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the peoples of the province of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also, let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Then when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands, from the least to the greatest. The king and his nobles were pleased with this advice, so the king did as Mamukin proposed. He sent dispatches to all the parts of the kingdom, to each province in its own script, and to each people in their own language, proclaiming that every man should be ruler over his own household using his native tongue. Later, when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kirsh, who had been carried away into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiachin, king of Judah. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother had died. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Hegai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Hegai, who had charge of the harem. She pleased him and won his favor. Immediately he provided her with beauty treatments and special food. He assigned to her 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace and moved her and her attendants into the best place in the harem. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. Before a young woman's turn came to go into King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given to her to take with from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go there, and in the morning return to another part of the harem to the care of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. When the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle, Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. When the virgins were assembled the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. But Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do. For she continued to follow Mordecai's instruction as she had done when he was bringing her up. So during that time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Bethana and Teresh, 2 of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the 2 officials were impaled on poles, which is pretty gross. And all this was recorded in the book of the Annals in the presence of the king. Wow, right? There is so much happening in the beginning of this. So just as a recap, as some highlights, did you catch, as the story opens, that King Xerxes displayed his wealth for 6 months? We just talked about 6 months. That's all the way back to like January 1st to now, that he was putting on display the wealth of his kingdom, right? There's some scholars that think, because of the timing of this, that it was in his 3rd reign, that one of the reasons he was doing that was to secure even more so, or to recruit even more supporters from the nobles, because he was about to go on a campaign where he was going to invade Greece and try to take Athens. And so part of this display, they say, was for that purpose. But then at the end of it, it's so interesting that Xerxes then throws a banquet in the palace garden for all the men of Susa, not just the nobles, but all the men that are in Susa for 7 days. 7 days of a party with an open bar. That's what's happening right now, okay? It's lavish, and what it's doing is it's demonstrating for the audience that is hearing Esther this lack of restraint. At the same time, so there's this party happening in the garden, and at the same time, Queen Vashti was holding a banquet for all the women within the palace. So after 7 days of drinking, Xerxes, in this drunken state, he sends for the queen so he could bring her in with all these men who have been drinking for 7 days and show off her beauty, right? This is a lose-lose situation for Queen Vashti. There's a professor and a doctor, Lynn Cohick. She explains that the king's command for Vashti to come to be brought in with all these men, it just wasn't done. It was so inappropriate that he would even ask this of her at this time, in this day. Because if the queen obeys the king like a subject ought to, then she's going to look like a bought woman. That will be her portrayal. And yet if she refuses the king, now she's a disobedient subject, and that can't happen either. So she chooses to stay in the banquet and not to go to the king. And at this point, the issue really is only about a king and a disobedient subject, right? But verse 13, we got to bring in the drunk advisors. They have to get involved, right? So we bring in the drunk advisors, and what do they advise? They don't just make it about a subject the king and the subject. They make it about a husband and a wife. But not just a husband and a wife, they make it about every single relationship in the whole kingdom, every husband and every wife. It's about all of it. So this escalates really quickly, and it's a matter that it could have been dealt with very privately. You know, King Xerxes, he's disrespected, and he could have privately and kept the matter private, and he could have just sent his wife, the queen, away. But no, now he's sending out a decree to the entire province, to 127 provinces, so that everybody can know that he was disrespected, right? So what was Vashti to do? If she had come into the room like she was told to do, then she would be dishonored. And then once the king came to his senses, once he had sobered up and realized what had happened, she would still be sent away because she would have acted dishonorably. So she chooses to do the honorable thing. And through her, through Queen Vashti, what the story is setting up for us, is to see this is the kind of man who Esther is going to be married to. And in the Jewish Bible, by showing us that he's not a man of restraint, he's a man that is of no restraint, it's showing, again, this Jewish audience that he is a man that is not a good man. This is not a good man. This is who we're going to find out that Esther marries. This man, the one of this character. So chapter 1 ends with Vashti's banished, and then chapter 2, once the king has sobered up, once he's come to his senses and he remembers the events, he remembers the decree, and he remembers, so yeah, hey, wait, now I don't have a wife, right? So that happens, and then his attendants, they suggest that let's send out commissioners to every province all across this whole empire, and we'll bring to Susa the beautiful young women, so that from one of them you can choose the queen. Again, in this time period, this would not be a normal thing. If you're going to choose a queen, the kings of that time, it would be one of noble birth, and it would be for strategic alliances, not necessarily based on beauty. Here, though, the young girls, and again, keeping with the times, probably between the ages of 12 to 15 years old, they're taken by emissaries in 127 provinces. You can see this Persian Empire, so there's the arrow pointing at Susa again, where they'll be brought to, but where it's darker, it's all across this way, even down into Egypt and up and around. That was the Persian Empire of the time. So across this whole way, they're going across, they sent people to take these young women, to bring them to Susa. And this is not a whimsical, open call for a beauty contest. These young girls, they're brought to Susa. It's more like that they were trafficked, okay? They are taken not because they have a will, not because they have a choice. They are being taken to Susa. And it might be tempting still to think with that, oh, what an honor, you know? But what's happening is they're already exiles across this whole way. It's not just Jews, but they're already exiles across this whole empire. And now their world is becoming smaller and smaller and smaller, right? The captivity that they're being brought into. They're basically being brought in. Yes, they're getting beauty treatments, but really for the purpose of what we may say would be a one-night stand with the king. And then after that happens, they're either considered a concubine, a slave, or a wife. So now they're put into a different harem and they're kept because they're only for the king. They would not be going home. Their sole purpose now is to simply please the king. And they've been taken from their families, from their communities, from everything they've ever known, and they've been brought to be put in this place. They're a conquered people. So in this second chapter, this is all happening. And in verse 5, we also learn, going through, that Mordecai, he's a Jew. And it's really interesting to see that the same lineage that is used to describe Mordecai is the same one that is used to describe King Saul, the first king of Israel. So the audience, the Jewish people, they would pick up on this right away, knowing that there's a tie being made to Mordecai and to King Saul. And we won't get there today, but in the next chapter, when they introduce the enemy of Mordecai, it shows this long-standing enemy tension between the different tribes of people. It's kind of West Side Story meets something else or whatever, but the audience would pick up on it right away. In addition, so going on in chapter 2, we learn that Mordecai's cousin, Esther, she lost both parents, and so then Mordecai took her in and raised her as his own daughter. And so with that, he had instructed her, Esther, to keep her identity secret. She wasn't being manipulative. It was for protection. And also what it's doing, what we're seeing happen in these first 2 chapters of the story of Esther, is the author is setting us up. Because when her identity is later revealed, it'll be a pivotal point that the story turns on. So Esther, she heeds the counsel of her cousin, and we see her heeding the counsel of the man over the harem. And she continues to walk in wisdom and to find favor with the overseer, and then that favor also extends before the king, and she's named the queen. And then the end of the second chapter, it concludes with this part of, while sitting at the king's gate, Mordecai overhears this plan to assassinate King Xerxes. So he tells Queen Esther, and Queen Esther tells the king. And just to think about this, so this man, we've already heard like a little display of who he is, what his character is, what his nature is like. Wouldn't it be so tempting to get to be the hero of that moment and you reveal the plan to the king and you take the credit for it? But the author specifically shares with us and tells us that Esther gave the credit to Mordecai. And even in addition to that, it's mentioned, it's intentional that it says, and it was listed in the annals of the kings. So again, what the author is doing in these first couple chapters for us is he's setting up some things that will later have significance. But in the moment, these characters, they don't know this. As we're reading through it, we don't know this. But it is setting the table, these first couple chapters, it's setting the table for a series of events. And as listeners, whether the Jews initially or us, we're seeing some victories, but the audience had to wonder, again, with the omission of God ever being mentioned, where is God? Where is God in all of this? Because as the story started, we see pride on display, we see power being flaunted and wealth, and we see a queen put Queen Vashti in an impossible situation. We see several young women being taken from their families, from their communities, from what they know, to be brought to be a part of a king's harem, to be put in this smaller cell, a tighter captivity. Yeah, it came with provisions, right? But it also came with a loss of freedom. It came with a loss of community. It came with a loss of value to be brought into this place. It was its own form of prison. The Jews, they had not wanted to be under the rule of a foreign king or government. They didn't desire to be dispersed like this. Queen Vashti, she had not wanted to be humiliated before all the nobles, before all the men and women, and to be exiled. Esther had not wanted to be taken to be a part of hundreds of other concubines on call for a king, and a pagan king at that. And they had to wonder, was this the intent? The situation they find themselves in, was this the desire or plan from God set out at the beginning? No. right? Not even close. The Jews know, and we can know that God's desire, he chose and desired intimacy with us. If we go back into the first 2 chapters of Genesis, we can see that there is a God who desired and set up. He wanted to walk in the cool of the day with man. He wanted to have an intimate and close relationship where there was interaction. And he desired to share all of creation with us. This was what God's design was. This is what he desired. And instead, he didn't want to be ruling over, enslaving, or exhibiting a power that was meant to intimidate or to crush, which is the contrast that we see exhibited through this Persian king. Right? We see this contrast of who God is, where he wanted a people separate. He wanted this nation of Israel to be separate, that they would have no earthly king, that they'd be set apart, belonging to him, and he would belong to them. And it would be like this covenant relationship, like a marriage, like the marriage that was described in Genesis 1 and 2, that was meant to be co-reigning, that was meant to be equal, that was meant to share things together. It wasn't meant to be as a husband ruling over a wife and the wife's desire for a husband, because we see that described in chapter 3 of Genesis, if you go back and read that. When that's described in this broken relationship, this wasn't God's prescription, okay? Hear this. This wasn't how God prescribed it, Genesis 3. This was a description of the result that came after the fall of man. This is how it was going to be because of the result of sin. If you want to know God's heart in the picture, Genesis 1 and 2, chapter 3 tells us this is the result of the fall, and this is what it will look like as a result of sin, and until the restoration of Jesus and the cross. And right now, we're still living in this tension of already but yet not, right? Where Jesus has come, he's died, he's restoring things, and yet we're still fighting this humanity, and the enemy of our souls has not been completely captivated yet. Captive, got it. So we're in this tension already of this. And yet, so with this, and we're feeling the effects of this, we could ask ourselves too, so where is God? We might find ourselves at times grieved, the results of sin, the ramifications of sin that we are feeling, and it might leave us with that same feeling and in different moments. Where is God? He didn't intend these things. He didn't desire that any of his sons or daughters be enslaved to another. He didn't intend or desire that any of his precious daughters be reduced to only be on call for the lust of another. That was not God's desire. That's not what he had intended. God did not design or desire this, and yet he was at work and is still at work in people's lives nonetheless. Queen Vashti, as we see in this first couple things, she's put in a lose-lose situation, and she chose to keep her honor. Esther is put in an undesirable situation, and she still chooses to walk humbly with wisdom, heeding counsel from Mordecai and then from the eunuch. And while in the midst of being put in a place, hear this, she did not choose. She chose to respond to God in honoring ways and poised. She didn't seek the position, and yet she continues to walk humbly. And God positions her. God gives her favor, even in a position, a placement she would not have chosen for herself. And so sometimes we can take from this that we find ourselves in positions that we would not choose for ourselves. It could be the result of decisions of those before us. It could have been for us the death of a parent or parents or a spouse. It could be an impossible moral decision. It could have been a loss of a job. It could have been COVID. It could be the economy. It could be an unexpected illness. It could have been an injury or an encounter or something that led us into addiction. It might be our own fault, or it might not be our fault. It could be that we may be reaping the results of our own decisions, or it could be that we are victim to decisions that have been made and the effects are affecting us. And yet, it's not the end of the story. But we may be wondering, and the characters had to be wondering, God, where are you? And we can know, because we've seen, if you read the whole story, that he's still working, he's moving, he's orchestrating, he's setting things up. He's continually desiring to bring his people to deliverance. That is who God is. And we have a choice to succumb to our captivity, to our situations that are undesirable, or to walk and to keep walking humbly, to keep responding humbly, to trust his nature and his character. And so that doesn't mean that we live as victims in the situation that we're in. It means that we live in response to him. And that's not to say that some of us are not in places that we ought to stay. And that's not to say that we don't hold space to grieve over injustices that have been done. That's not what that we're saying. Instead, when some things are beyond our control, when perhaps at times we find ourselves in positions we would not choose for ourselves, we can view our placement with a greater perspective. We can view him. What are the things that I know of God? What are the truths? If we don't know, you can see from here, from in the scriptures, if we read that, we know, if we read it in here, maybe we haven't experienced it, we can know that it says that he's for us, that it says that he's sovereign. We know all throughout reading these stories that he desires restoration for his people. And in Paul's letter to the Romans, let's go ahead and we're going to look at that real quick. Romans 8, we'll start in verse 26. This is not the whole of it, and it needs a deeper dive, but in Romans 8, verse 26, it says that in the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. And he who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren and sisters. And those he predestined, he also called. And those he called, he also justified. And those he justified, he also glorified. And I know we're just highlighting that. It'd be worth going back and really reading around it, because what we're highlighting this morning is that this is not a promise of escape that he's saying. Not in the physical anyway. You'll see if you go on reading that we are more than conquerors in Jesus. But in the physical, what it's saying that, even if we find ourselves in situations where God did not intend, things done to us or the ramifications, the effects of sin felt, that no matter, when we're yielded to him, God will use it all to help shape us, to help conform us, it says, more to his likeness. That's not always a fun process. To further reflect his glory in us, through us, and to position us, to use us where we're placed. When we find ourselves in positions we would not choose for ourselves, look to God, look at God, and maybe consider, maybe pause to ask, could it be too that it's not just about me? What if my placement is about more than just me? This last week, I was listening to a voice recording from one of our missionaries that we support, and she was sharing, almost apologizing, that she had been so busy traveling. It was good. They were going, she and a companion were going from person to person, and really good conversations, interactions, ministering. And yet, because they were so busy traveling, she hadn't had time to write. And when she was sharing it made me think, what if Paul hadn't been in prison for the time that he was? Would it be that we would still have all those letters? I mean, almost the entirety of the New Testament, what we have, are letters that Paul wrote while he was placed in prison. So if he hadn't been positioned there, and it's not that Paul wanted to be in prison. There was a time where he appealed to Caesar, which caused him, to be there longer. Yet if he hadn't been in prison, would he have paused? Would we have the letters we have now in circulation that are still impacting us today? Even while Paul was in prison and he was writing to believers in Philippi, he's saying about this context that he's learned to be content in every circumstance. He wasn't even focused on the condition he was in. He was still about allowing his placement to serve the benefit of others. There's a time, you may have heard me echo this before, but there was a time where I was working at a Walmart in California, and the reason that I had gone there initially was not existent anymore. And I found myself frustrated and verbalizing to the Lord, God, I did not come out here to work at Walmart. And yet, I'm not so sure about that. Because still looking back to that time, it was one of the most rewarding, one of the most fruitful times ever where God used that space in living life day to day with my coworkers, where he allowed me to be positioned in a place where they could come to know him, where I could pastor my coworkers, where I could be a conduit of his ministry. And then even through that time, I met a coworker who she and her husband had a ministry where then I ended up serving with them for several years after that. So ministry flows through relationship. And it happens in proximity. I was just sharing with una hermanita que yo tuve, un profesor que decía esto a minuto. That's for her because she's watching right now. But I had a professor who said, and would say this often, that ministry flows through relationship. What if your positioning, what if your placement is not just about you? Okay, I would say 100% it's not. I'd say almost, but 100% it's not all about you. That's a statistic that I myself came up with. God is multifaceted. Of course he's good, and of course he's continuing to work within us if we'll allow him. If we continue to honestly yield our hearts to him and our responses, of course, his desire is to transform us more into his likeness, into the fullness of all he's designed and destined for us. And yet, it's not just about you. Let me make that more encompassing. It's not just about us. It's not about us. It is and it isn't. From the time that Queen Vashti, she was exiled, to Esther being taken and appointed as queen, to the time when a plan was put in place to annihilate the Jews, and sorry if that's a spoiler alert for you in reading the story, but several years had passed. We're only in the first couple chapters of the story, so Esther doesn't know what is to come. These characters don't know what is to come, and yet Esther remained faithful, obedient in her posture before the Lord day by day, and honoring in her character and relationship with others. We see both of those things exhibited. If she had not been faithful, eyes and heart steadfastly on the Lord, and character honoring to those around her, she would not have been positioned as a conduit of deliverance in her placement. Hear me, because the posture of her heart would not have been in the right place. Even if physically she was in the right place, her posture of her heart, she would not have been positioned in a way that God could bring about deliverance through her, or that he would have chose to. So wherever we are, no matter where we are, whether we want to be there, chose to be there, we're forced to be there, if he's not telling you to move on out of where you are, then he's allowed you to be positioned there. And so could it be, it is also for the proximity and the impact in the ministry of others. If you know Jesus, he's positioned you as a conduit of deliverance in your placement. We may not see physical deliverance on this side, yet our God is in the business of deliverance. And so do you know the way to life? Do you know what spiritual freedom is? Do you know Jesus? Then lead others to him. In your character, in your posture, in your words, in your steadfastness, be a Paul, who while in prison, it says he counted it all joy, right? While in prison, he pointed others to truth. He used the space and the place where God had positioned him, and we're still benefiting from it. Be an Esther, who while unjustly taken, she continued to engage wisely, humbly heeding voices of wise counsel around her, growing in favor in the relationships that she was in. There's more of the story to unfold. We don't know what is yet to come. We're only in the first couple chapters. She couldn't always see it. God, where are you? And yet, he was at work behind the scenes. So while we wait, while we're in the here and now, whether you want to write these down or take a picture, strongly want to encourage that you take some time to actually have a discussion with God with these questions. And it could be that you want to linger longer today, do that. But if you're not going to do that, make a point that you would have this discussion with the Lord. Because if we don't stop and reflect and have these conversations and hear what the Lord would say and then choose to respond, we're not growing. Right? We're just here. So this is our response with this, that you would take some time, that we would take some time to ask God, God, where have you allowed me to be positioned? Or where have you placed me? And the other question would be, and how am I to respond in the day in and the day out? Or how am I to posture my heart in response to you and to the relationships around me? If we could have just a couple of our prayer team members come and be available. We don't know what God yet has in store. We don't know what story is yet being written, but in the here and now, let's keep our eyes on him and our obedience steadfast in the details. God is working behind the scenes, and you don't know in what ways he may be placing you as an Esther for others. The place he's putting you, the posture of where he's positioned you. So again, this week as we're closing, if you need to pause and reflect on these, please do so. If you need to ask somebody next to you to pray with you based on something that God's begun stirring and you want to pray together with that, do that. If you want to come up and have some of our prayer team pray over you, please do that. But no matter, take some time that personally you have this discussion with the Lord, where you ask him these questions and you hear and listen for his response. And in addition to that, read or reread Esther, because we're going to be spending some time in it this month, and we want to give opportunity that everything the Lord will want to challenge or impart to us from his word, that we are ready and poised and ready for that. So God, we thank you. Thank you. God, who you are it's incredible, and we can't even understand just the glimpses. Lord, the ways that you show us the nature of your heart and the great extent you have for us, that you are the King of Kings, and yet you desire this intimacy and this closeness with us. You desire to show us value and to share your creation with us. You desire more for us. And God, even when we can't understand at times why we are where we are, whether our fault or not, we thank you that we can know your nature, your character. We can know that you desire to work in and through us. You desire to work around us, and you are inviting us in to be a part of the work that you desire to do that is beyond us. So God, thanks for this. We ask that we wouldn't be a people that just go through the motions, that we wouldn't be a people that just are biding our time, but instead we would truly open ourselves up to ask the questions, to pause in here and to see what you're inviting us into. That our heart and response to you and to people would be more and more who you're calling us to be and in line with that. We just thank you, God. Cause us to see more of who you are and to respond in an appropriate manner. Just thanks, God. In your great and awesome name, let it be. Amen. Blessings. You guys go. Make sure you spend time with that. And you are loved. We'll see you later.